The same religion that's capable of hideous acts of destruction can also be capable of moments of healing, of restoration, and of hope.
But educate a girl, and you educate her entire family.
There is a sun within every person.
When that anger sets in, write it. Write the letters, but don't send them. You never want to leave concrete proof of insanity.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Campbell Hall. It's nice to have you here. My name is Roman Baratiak with the UCSB Arts and Lectures program. It's a real thrill and delight for us to be able to present the #1 best-selling nonfiction author in the country, according to the New York Times, Michael Pollan. It shows that you can be an academic at UC Berkeley and still be a best-selling author at the same time. It's a great honor to have Michael here with us. He has an incredibly busy schedule, and to make time to visit us here in Santa Barbara is a real gift. So thank you very much, Michael. The format for tonight, Michael will deliver a 45-minute lecture. We'll follow that. We'll take the podium off stage. Then we'll set up 2 chairs, and we'll have an on-stage conversation between Michael and Stephanie Lemenager from the English department here at UCSB. Then we will follow that with your questions. We have microphones here at the front. Very important that you use the microphones for your questions. Please, no statements, no notices about rallies or any other things like that. A question for Michael Pollan would be appreciated. And then we will follow that with an on-stage book signing. Borders is in the lobby with the new book of Michael's, as well as some previous titles. So please stop at the table if you haven't seen it there. I realized it was pretty crowded in the lobby on the way in. One last thing, please take a moment now to turn off your cell phones and keep them turned off throughout the lecture this evening. Now it's my great pleasure for the formal introduction to present to you Stephanie Lemenager. She's Associate Professor here in the English Department at UCSB, where she teaches classes in English and Environmental Studies. She directs the American Cultures and Global Context Center, which is currently pursuing a 2-year theme on global ecologies. Her current book addresses climate change anxiety from a historical perspective. Please welcome Stephanie Lemenager.
Well, as many of you no doubt know, Michael Pollan has authored 5 award-winning books and numerous articles. He's a contributing editor and writer to the New York Times Magazine. He served for many years as executive editor of Harper's Magazine and is now the Knight Professor of Science and Environmental Journalism at UC Berkeley. His numerous journalistic awards include the James Beard Award for Best Magazine Series of 2003, and the Reuters IUCN 2000 Global Award for Environmental Journalism. His last book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of 4 Meals, was named one of the 10 best books of 2006 by both the New York Times and the Washington Post, and that was also a book that won multiple awards. His latest book, In Defense of Food, An Eater's Manifesto, has already received excellent reviews, including a wonderfully witty one by Janet Maslin of the New York Times. I myself first encountered Michael Pollan's work several years ago when I began teaching his book Second Nature, A Gardener's Education, in a literature and environment class that I offer here at UCSB. And that book, which is Pollan's first, does something for the reader and environmental enthusiast that few books labeled environmental nonfiction do. It relieves anxiety. And in saying that, I don't mean to imply that the book is light reading. but rather that it offers a way out of the romantic philosophy of wilderness that writers like Henry David Thoreau inadvertently propagated, to the detriment, as it turned out, of real productive thought about the relationship between humans and the non-human world. Along with environmental historians such as William Cronin and fellow journalists like Bill McKibben, Pollan in the late 20th century began to teach us to get over nature. That is, if we conceived of nature as a kind of pristine place apart from human design. Pollan also imagined and continues to imagine pragmatic alternatives to the romantic zero-sum game of man versus nature, practical means for channeling our biophilia, living together with non-humans, and essentially getting over ourselves. The anxiety attendant upon the condition of being human surfaces again as an environmental hazard in Pollan's fifth and latest book, In Defense of Food, An Eater's Manifesto. Here, the existential problem that Pollan explored from another angle as, quote, the omnivore's dilemma, returns as a culturally specific eating disorder that he calls orthorexia, or an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. What to eat, how much. Pollan's poetically simple response to these worried questions is eat food, not too much, and mostly plants. And I think that these three rules could actually be a kind of battering ram that destroys the befuddling rhetoric of nutritionism, which is an ideology that he contends has actually robbed us of our common sense relationship to food. What Michael Pollan does for us, certainly what he does for me, in his Eater's Manifesto, is essentially what he did for us in the omnivore's dilemma, but with different emphases. He restores food contexts, and in doing so, he restores meaning, referentiality, to words that have been strategically misused and that no longer refer to anything in particular. For instance, the word food. Restoring meaningful context and reattaching words to reference that can be grasped even by our senses, these are gifts that empower, that relieve eco-anxiety, which is now a diagnosable condition, that make possible democracy and wise consumerism, and that mark Michael Pollan both as a brilliant ecological detective and an immensely talented writer. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Michael Pollan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming this evening. I understand that there was some competition across campus. I appreciate your votes. It's a pleasure. It's a special pleasure to be in Santa Barbara, which is, many of you realize, I hope, one of the places where the American food system is being reinvented right now, and there are some very notable players in this movement, and wonderful farms and innovation in the food system. So a lot of you, I think, will know what I'm talking about and are exemplars of the kind of changes that this manifesto is arguing for. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the thinking behind this new book, how I came to write it, and read a brief passage or two to give you a little bit of flavor of it before we have this onstage conversation with Stephanie, which I'm really looking forward to, and to hear your questions. And when we get to your questions, I hope you won't ask me too much about specific nutrients or foods. I'm getting the strangest questions on this book tour. Last night someone said, "So can you offer us any pejoratives about kelp?" I didn't know what to do with that. I have nothing against kelp. I don't like to eat it, but I mean, I hear it's good food. Now, how many people in this room read at least some of Omnivore's Dilemma? Wow. Well, I read this. I wrote this book partly out of concern for your welfare. I kept running into people after I published Omnivore's Dilemma who would come up to me and say, I've read about half your book and I'm afraid to go any further. And I would say, why? That's kind of troubling to hear as a writer. I know it is a long book, but They would say, well, every time I turn the page, there's something else I can't eat anymore. And I'm afraid if I get to the end, I'll starve. There'll be nothing left. Now, in doing that book, went to the, deep into the heart of darkness of the American food system. But I did come out still eating, and it's very important we keep eating, and did find that there were a lot of, very happy and encouraging options out there. And I guess I hadn't put enough emphasis on that. So it occurred to me that there, even among people who'd read this book, there was still such anxiety, and perhaps I'd contributed to that anxiety about eating, especially with regard to personal health, that I thought, well, it might be useful to try to get to the bottom of why we have this anxiety about eating, what Stephanie said, called orthorexia. I call it the American paradox also, people who are so concerned with nutrition and yet have such poor dietary health. And how could these two things coexist? And I want to suggest why that might be so. So what I was trying to do in this book was offer some very concrete rules of thumb, kind of algorithms to help people navigate this, what has become a very treacherous food landscape. And as I dug down deep, trying to learn what I could about the links between diet and health, it occurred to me that the biggest problem we had was our outlook on food, the ideology that we use to make our food decisions and think about food, which, and I use the term for that Stephanie mentioned, nutritionism. And I want to tell you a little bit about nutritionism and where I think it came from and why I think it's such a bad development in our relationship to food and how we might clear our minds of this way of looking at food. Ideologies are very slippery things. They're ways of organizing experience that we're often unconscious of. They're sort of like the weather or the water we drink, and we're not really aware of the assumptions underlying them. But when we get in touch with those assumptions, when we begin to look at an ideology and stand back a few steps and kind of take a Martian's eye view of it, sometimes we can begin to control it rather than have it control us. So let's try to do that with nutritionism. There are four premises, I think, underlying nutrition, four important ones. There's some minor ones too. The first, of course, is that the important unit when you're thinking about food is the nutrient. That foods are collections of nutrients, and if you get the right ones and avoid the wrong ones, that's the key to health. The assumption is that foods are the sum of their nutrient parts. And I think a lot of us accept this without thinking about it too much, because it's certainly the way the food marketplace is now organized. Now, what follows from this is the second premise, because nutrients are, at least compared to foods, invisible and therefore slightly mysterious. It falls to experts, scientists, journalists, food scientists, and food marketers to explain the hidden reality of food to us. It's a little bit like a religion. If the important thing is invisible, we require priests to help us commune with the important thing. And in this case, that important thing are these mysterious nutrients. Because, of course, who has seen a nutrient except the scientists with their microscope? We've never seen nutrients. Have you ever seen an antioxidant? Another assumption. Like most ideologies, nutritionism divides the world into good and evil. So that in American dietary history, there is always a satanic nutrient we are trying to drive from the food supply. For many years, of course, it was dietary fat. During the Cold War, that was the communism of food, right? Saturated fat in particular. And then on the other side, you had the blessed nutrient, the savior nutrient, that if you just ate enough of that one, you were going to be fine and you might live forever. So we had fiber for many years. We had, we now have we had polyunsaturated fatty acids, that those were okay, and in fact would really help and restore the health of our heart. And now, of course, the great savior nutrient is the omega-3 fatty acid. And I predict the next evil nutrient mark my words, will be the omega-6 fatty acid. We are very close to a moment where there will be a raft of products filling your supermarkets boasting about the fact they have low or no omega-6 fatty acids. This is the war between omega-6 and omega-3 that you'll soon be learning about, and they're in this kind of zero-sum relationship, and I can tell you more about that later. And then the fourth assumption, and this is the one that I think we don't realize how weird this is, but that we look at food as primarily, the whole point of eating is to maintain and promote bodily health. We take this for granted, that in our eating we're either ruining our health or we're saving our health, but that's what it's about. And we forget that there have been many people through history, and there are many people in other cultures still, who eat for a wide variety of other reasons. They eat for pleasure. They eat for community. They eat to express their identity. They eat for ritual reasons. There are a great many other equally legitimate reasons to eat. But we seem to have narrowed it down to this one thing, health. And this is what I mean about being a nation of orthorexics. I didn't coin this. This is a term coined by a doctor, a shrink, who was seeing more and more patients who had this unhealthy obsession with healthy eating, and that they were paralyzed in their food decisions, such that they couldn't eat anything. Now, how did this ideology come to take hold of American culture? And increasingly, by the way, world cultures. This way of thinking about food is spreading. But we are really the champs of nutritionism in this country, I'm proud to say. Well, if you look back in American history, one of the things that really surprised me, I thought it was a strictly modern phenomenon. But in fact, Americans have embraced this scientism in their eating. Going back to the 1860s and 1870s, there was an obsession with improving the diet of immigrant populations who supposedly weren't eating well, and giving them the lessons of the new nutrition science. And then you had Sylvester Graham with his graham cracker preaching the evils of protein. And then you had, around the turn of the last century, you had Horace Fletcher and John Harvey Kellogg, who were, great nutritional heroes, absolute quacks, but great nutritional heroes. Horace Fletcher believed that, we should chew every bite 100 times, and that this would be the key to health and longevity. And he himself was an incredibly healthy guy. He was known for being able to run up and down the Washington Monument without stopping to catch his breath. And if you do chew that much, you will lose weight, because there's just not enough time in the day to swallow enough food to get fat. But what a way to eat. And by the way, we talk about this guy as a quack, and he was a quack, but he was followed by a lot of very intelligent people. The James brothers, William and Henry James, were great believers in Horace Fletcher's work, and John Harvey Kellogg's work was followed by Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Ford. All of them went to the sanitarium, and they practiced 100-time chewing, and they sang chewing songs to urge people on, and they had these hourly enemas that were believed to be very helpful with Bulgarian yogurt, and all these crazy, crazy things. The enemy then, by the way, was protein, and they invented breakfast cereal to drive protein out of the morning meal. So there's a history of eating pseudo-scientifically in America, and I would contend we're still doing it. The modern history of nutritionism, though, the nutritionism's hold in our lifetime really dates back to the 1970s. And there are a couple red-letter dates that I was able to find as I tried to trace this history. One is a very obscure historical event in 1973, and that was what is called the repeal of the imitation rule. There had been a rule in American, an FDA rule that was built into the founding act of the Food and Drug Administration in 1938 that held that if you were going to take a traditional food that everybody knew and had expectations about, such as bread or pasta or sour cream or yogurt, and you were to fundamentally change its constituents, you couldn't call it bread or sour cream or yogurt or pasta. You had to call it imitation bread or sour cream or imitation yogurt. It seemed like okay, not a bad thing to do. It protected us from adulterants, which we were very concerned about, going back to Upton Sinclair and what he learned was going on in Packingtown in the meat industry and all the strange things that were getting into sausage. So the purity of food, the fact that they conform to our expectations of what those foods were, very important principle. In '73, we throw this out at the behest of industry and at the behest of the American Heart Association. Why are they interested in throwing this out? Because they're very interested in getting the fat out of the American food supply. And if imitation foods are the way to get people to eat less saturated fat, which they had decided was the great evil of the moment, well, what stood in the way of re-engineering the whole food supply was this imitation rule, because nobody would buy imitation pasta. Would you? No. It's the kiss of death in the marketplace. So they, without much notice, and in fact, even though it was a federal law, the FDA threw it out on its own. So some enterprising lawyer could probably sue to get it reinstated, and I encourage that lawyer to, to act. So that was one red letter day. The next one comes in 1977, and this is a slightly more famous episode. And that is when Senator George McGovern, who was chair of a Senate Select Committee on Nutrition, issued a set of dietary goals for the United States. There was a lot of concern about heart disease at that time, and he took some hearings and listened to the doctors and the cardiologists, and the consensus seemed to be that saturated fat, animal fats, were the problem. And he endeavored to do something we had never done before in America, which is have the government weigh in on not just a particular group's diet that might perhaps have a problem, you know, diabetics or people with nutritional deficiencies. No, the whole country should change the way it eats. And he came up with this set of goals, and one of those goals was this. He said, eat less red meat. Very simple. Everyone understands what he's talking about. He's talking about food. He's saying eat less of a particular food, and this will help with heart disease. May or may not be true, but that was the message. Well, this message turned out to be the most inflammatory thing he had ever said. And the industry came down on him like a ton of bricks. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the Pork Producers Council, the grocery manufacturers, everybody just protested. And there was a firestorm of criticism. And McGovern, who of course came from a state full of cattle ranchers, was forced to beat a hasty retreat and to rewrite the dietary goals and compromise with industry about them. And so this is how that sentence got rewritten. From eat less red meat to choose meats that will reduce your saturated fat intake. Now, what are the differences between those two things? Well, one makes sense and everyone knows what you're talking about. The other one is kind of obscure and hard to understand unless you understand what saturated fat is. Also, the second one doesn't have a less in it. It's not saying eat less of anything. It's saying eat more of meat that has these qualities. And the third thing that's different, and this is key, is we're talking now not about foods, but nutrients. The conversation, and this is the only acceptable conversation to industry, is to talk about nutrients, not whole foods. Because the industry can always manipulate nutrients. But if the government is going to weigh in saying eat less of a particular food, that is a disaster. So that began a taboo in public discussion of food that lasts to this day. The government cannot say eat less of anything. They can say choose foods that lower your intake of this or that, but they will not tell you to eat less of anything. And that's one important reason why government health advice, when it comes to food, is essentially useless and largely corrupt. Am I speaking too plainly? I'm sorry. This language got picked up in a 1982 National Academy of Sciences statement about diet and cancer. And they used the same language. Instead of talking about fruits and vegetables as being protective against cancer, they talked about antioxidants and beta-carotene and vitamins in these foods as being protective. And over the protests of several members of that committee who said, we don't know that about beta-carotene. We know that foods containing beta-carotene have these effects, but they made that leap. They went right to the beta-carotene. So this became the official way of talking about food, and lo and behold, it was beloved by industry. I'm going to read a brief passage about what happened to the food supply once we'd established this frame for our food. And this little chapter, it's a mini chapter, is called Food Science's Golden Age. In the years following the 1977 dietary goals and the 1982 National Academy of Sciences report on diet and cancer, the food industry, armed with its regulatory absolution, set about re-engineering thousands of popular food products to contain more of the nutrients that science and government had deemed the good ones and fewer of the bad. A golden age for food science dawned. Hyphens sprouted like dandelions in the supermarket aisles. Low fat, no cholesterol, high fiber. Ingredient labels on formerly 2 or 3 ingredient foods such as mayonnaise and bread and yogurt ballooned with lengthy lists of new additives, what in a more benighted age would have been called adulterants. The year of eating oat bran, also known as 1988, served as a kind of coming out party for the food scientist who succeeded in getting the material into nearly every processed food sold in America. Oat bran's moment on the dietary stage didn't last long, but the pattern now was set. And every few years since then, a new oat bran has taken its star turn under the marketing lights. Here come omega-3s. You would not think that common food animals could themselves be rejiggered to fit nutritionist fashion, but in fact some of them could be and were in response to the 77 and 82 guidelines, as animal scientists figured out how to breed leaner pigs and select for leaner beef. With widespread lipophobia taking hold of the human population, countless cattle lost their marbling, and lean pork was repositioned as the new white meat. Tasteless and tough as running shoes, perhaps, but now even a pork chop could compete with chicken as a way for eaters to reduce their saturated fat intake. In the years since, egg producers figured out a clever way to redeem even the disreputable egg. By feeding flaxseed to hens, they could elevate levels of omega-3 fatty acids in the yolks. Aiming to do the same thing for pork and beef fat, the animal scientists are now at work genetically engineering omega-3 fatty acids into pigs and persuading cattle to lunch on flaxseed in the hope of introducing the blessed fish fat, where it had never gone before, into hot dogs and hamburgers. But these whole foods are the exception. The typical whole food has much more trouble competing under the rules of nutritionism, if only because something like a banana or an avocado can't as readily change its nutritional stripes. Though rest assured, the genetic engineers are hard at work on this problem. To date, at least, they can't put oat bran in a banana or omega-3s in a peach. So depending on the reigning nutritional orthodoxy, the avocado might either be a high-fat food to be assiduously avoided, old think, or a food high in good monounsaturated fats to be embraced, new think. The fate and supermarket sales of each whole food rises and falls with every change in the nutritional weather, while the processed foods simply get reformulated and differently supplemented. That's why when the Atkins diet storm hit the food industry in 2003, bread and pasta got a quick redesign, dialing back the carbs, boosting the protein, while the poor, unreconstructed potatoes and carrots were left out in the carbohydrate cold. A handful of lucky whole foods has recently gotten the good nutrient marketing treatment. The antioxidants in the pomegranate, a fruit formerly more trouble to eat than it was worth, now protect against cancer and, get this, erectile dysfunction. They have done the research. They have the research. And you know how they did it? They studied, no, listen, they studied rabbits. Did you think rabbits had this problem? Evidently they do. A whole subcategory of nutritional science, funded by industry and, according to one recent analysis, remarkably reliable in its ability to find a health benefit in whatever food it has been commissioned to study, has sprung up to give a nutritionist sheen and FDA-approved health claim to all sorts of foods, including some not ordinarily thought of as healthy. The Mars Corporation recently endowed a chair in chocolate science at the University of California at Davis, where research on the antioxidant properties of cacao is making steady breakthroughs, so it shouldn't be long before we see chocolate bars bearing FDA-approved health claims. And when we do, nutritionism will surely have entered its Baroque phase. Yet as a general rule, it's a whole lot easier to slap a health claim on a box of sugary cereal than on a raw potato or a carrot, with the perverse result that the most healthful foods in the supermarket sit there quietly in the produce section, silent as stroke victims, while a few aisles over in cereal, the Cocoa Puffs and Lucky Charms are screaming their newfound whole grain goodness to the rafters. Thanks. Thank you. So you see, nutritionism as an ideology is the best thing that ever happened to the food industry, because the food industry profits from making the most complex processed foods possible. It's very hard to make money selling real food. Any farmer in the audience knows this. It's so much easier to take something simple, some commodity like corn or soy or, say, oatmeal, and turning it into a processed food. Oatmeal, rolled oats, go to the supermarket. You can get a pound of organic rolled oats for 79 cents. A pound of oats is a lot of oats. So you can't make money selling that. And the price is always going down because American farmers get more and more productive. So you make Cheerios. You take those oats, take 5 or 10 cents worth of oats, and turn them into these little donut-shaped things, and you have a marketing campaign and a nice name, and you add various other ingredients to make it even more attractive and convenient. Now, you don't have to cook them, you just add milk. And then you've got a good business, $4 off of 10 cents worth of oats. And then, though, even that turns into a commodity as the store brands come in and they make their store, Cheerios that are really just as good and look exactly the same. So you have to complicate the food further because you need to grow and you need new product lines. So what do? You make Honey Nut Cheerio cereal bars. Have you seen these things? They come in, they're multiple pieces of packaging, and there is this little thing that is a layer of cereal glued together, separated, 2 layers, and in the middle is milk, okay? And there's a picture of milk on the cover. Now, you wouldn't think you could do milk in processed food. Well, they have figured out how to make a milk-like edible substance that goes in the middle, and it has lots of calcium, and you can eat those on the run, in the car, on your way to school, in the lunchbox. And now you're making, what? You're making $10 or $15 a pound probably for those oats. And then you go to the next step, and the next thing in the cereal aisle appears to be, and the cereal aisle is a great place to study nutritionism. It really is the full flowering of this ideology, is the cereal straw. Have you seen these? They take the Cheerio material or some other, grain, cheap grain, and they extrude it in this long straw, and in the inside they line it with that same milk material, and your children are supposed to suck their milk through this straw, and then they consume the straw. This is a really cool product, and parents feel good about it because it's getting your kids to drink more milk, which is allegedly a good thing for parents to do. So all these products are marketed in a way that they appeal to kids. It's candy, really, and but there's always a message for the parents to license the purchase of these things, whole grain goodness, or helps your kid drink more milk. So that's how the industry makes money, and it needs new products all the time. It needs added levels of complexity, and nutritionism is always giving a new theory, a new hot nutrient around which you can rejigger your food, and Whole Foods can't do that. So that's why nutritionism is much beloved by industry. Now, if nutritionism worked, if thinking about food as a collection of nutrients, eating for health, dividing the world into good and evil nutrients, was a workable way to make people healthier, I would have no problem with it. Well, I would still have a problem with it, but, because it does take a lot of the pleasure out of eating. But let's say it didn't. Let's say it worked. It would be okay. It would be worth it. It would be a trade-off, I suppose, if we could use nutritionism to conquer the kind of chronic diseases that kill most of us. 4 out of the 10 top killers in America are chronic diseases caused by diet. So if nutritionism worked, okay, we could give it a chance. But it doesn't work. And this is the most troubling thing about it. For it to work, we would have to know what the important nutrients are. We would have to be able to measure those nutrients. We would have to know that those nutrients, ripped out of their food context, work. But none of this is true. Nutrition science is a very interesting science. It's a very promising science, but it's also a very young science. It's only about 170 years old. That's when Gustav Liebig and an Englishman named Prout determined that carbohydrates, proteins, fats, those are the key nutrients. If we get those, we're going to be all right. And this is how we started looking at food this way. And they made a baby formula with those 3 nutrients, and the babies died. gee, we're missing something. Yeah, they were missing something. And we sent Englishmen on long ocean voyages with plenty of fat, protein, and carbohydrates, and they got sick. They got scurvy. They got rickets. What was wrong? Well, we'd overlooked this other class of nutrients called vitamins. So we made baby formula with vitamins in it. Now we thought, now we've got it. This is as good as nature's milk. But in fact, the babies failed to thrive. They had problems with their visual development, their mental development. What happened? Oh, we didn't know about omega-3 fatty acids. So then we added those in. And we didn't know about the antioxidants and all the kind of minor plant chemicals that are turning out to not be so minor. So the whole history of nutrition science is the history of overlooked nutrients. We do not yet know what is going on deep in the soul of a carrot. It is a mystery. Foods are very complex systems. They are the product of coevolution between their eaters and themselves, in which they change to suit our desires. This is the story I tell in Botany of Desire. And we change so that we can make very good use of the nutrients they have in them. It's this brilliant system of design that unfolds over thousands of years by trial and error. These are very complex systems. They are more than the sum of their nutrient parts. They are, in fact, not just things, they are relationships, are the domesticated species on which we depend. So at that end of the food chain, we have a very interesting mystery that we have not solved. Maybe someday we will, maybe we won't. And in fact, we don't even need to. But let's stipulate that. So that's one side of the food chain. Other side of the food chain, our bodies, our digestive tracts, also very imperfectly understood systems. Digestion looks like a pretty simple process of breaking complex things down into their chemical parts. But in fact, it's more complicated than that. It's a very complex system. Did you know that you have as many neurons in your digestive tract as you have in your spinal column? What are they thinking? Why do you need neurons to digest food? Not well understood at all. So another mystery. So the point is, the science is young. As I see it, nutrition science is where surgery was in about 1650. Really interesting, really promising, but I'm not ready to get on the table. And we should not be ready to change the way we eat based on where they are right now. I spent a lot of time looking at nutrition science and how it's done, and as soon as you do that, you realize why it's so imperfect. I mean, to understand the effect of a certain diet on a certain population, you do have to know what that population is actually eating. How do they determine that? Well, the best way they can, since they can't follow everybody around with an invisible person with a camera taking pictures of everything they eat all the time, they give them questionnaires. And every 3 months, if you're in one of these big dietary trials, you fill out what's called a food frequency questionnaire. Now, I tried to fill one of these out, and I urge you to try. You can find them on the web. It asks you questions like, how many times in the last 3 months did you eat half a cup of broccoli? What is half a cup of broccoli? How much is that? And when you did, what sort of fat was it cooked in? I don't know. I don't remember. And when I ate broccoli in a restaurant, I have no idea what kind of fat it was cooked with. And we eat about half our meals out now, or they're at least prepared by someone else. We know, in fact, that people lie on these food frequency questionnaires. People lie more about food than just about anything but sex, probably, on there. But even if they're telling the truth, and I tried when I filled this out to be as truthful and complete as I could about what I'd eaten over that past 3 months, it reported, when I fed it into the computer over the web, it reported I was eating 1,200 calories a day. Now, I would vanish if I were eating 1,200 calories a day. Clearly, I was missing more than 1,000 calories a day. So we know, they know that these food frequency questionnaires are off by about 30%. Okay? This is the data on which these large conclusions are based. Very faulty data. And there's a series of other problems with the science. I mean, you can't, for example, when you're doing nutrition studies, unlike, say, pharmaceutical studies, you can't use a placebo. There's no placebo for broccoli. There's no placebo for fat. I mean, so you can't really do those kind of real double-blind tests of people's eating. So it's a, I don't mean to dismiss it. I think it's important science. I think we should pay attention to what they're doing, but I think we also should be very patient and not change our world based on what they figured out this week. So nutrition science is not in a position to tell us how to eat. Now, my other problem with nutritionism, the last problem I think with nutritionism, is that although it was created, modern nutritionism, to deal with a serious problem, which is to say the Western diet and what it's doing to our health, in the end, it obscures that elephant in the room. It doesn't really help us deal with it. And this is what we do know. I tried very hard in this book to get back to whatever solid ground of knowledge we have about food and health. And there are a couple big facts we know. And in fact, they're the only facts we need to know to decide how to eat. The big fact, and this we have known since the 1890s or so, 1880s, is that people who eat a Western diet, people who are introduced to this Western diet, and let me quickly define it. It's a diet characterized by lots of refined grains, lots of processed food, lots of red meat, and lots of processed meat, and very few fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Okay? It's the basic fast food diet, processed food diet out of the middle of the supermarket. People who eat this way or are introduced to this diet reliably get a sequence of diseases that the researchers who discovered this fact, and they discovered it by being in Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific Islands when this diet was introduced, and seeing populations that had no cancer and had no heart disease and had no diabetes get these diseases, they decided to call it, because it was clear to them what was causing this, the Western diseases caused by the Western diet. So this is not controversial. It's amazing, but it's not controversial. Why is it amazing? Because these medical workers, and Albert Schweitzer was one of them, by the way. He wrote about this and was very alert to it as people started eating the white man's diet. He found all these new diseases. But also Weston Price, an American dentist who did this research, and a guy named Burkitt's and McCarrison, English nutrition scientists, in different parts of the world. They observed that people eating traditional diets of many different kinds were remarkably healthy. And what was striking about this is how different these traditional diets were. So, for example, the Maasai warriors in Africa, who eat very little other than cow's blood, beef, and milk, are some of the healthiest people on earth. And you have Central Americans and Mexicans eating, by and large, a diet of corn and beans and smattering of vegetables, smattering of meat, very healthy. You have Inuit in Greenland eating seal blubber and lichens, no diabetes, very little cancer, no heart disease. So what this tells us is that the human body is remarkably well adapted, and if you compare that to other animals, say, remarkably well adapted to a great many different foods. We are omnivores, and we can live in 6 of the 7 continents for this reason. We can be healthy on there is no one ideal diet for humans. That's a very important lesson from this. The amazing thing is, though, that there is one diet to which we clearly are poorly adapted. And it happens to be the diet most of us are eating. How is it that, thousands of years of civilization should have created the one way of eating that kills people? This is astounding. So the challenge begins to figure out how to escape this Western diet without having to leave civilization. Because if you're willing to leave civilization, by the way, it's easy. I mean, I describe very interesting experiments where Aborigines who'd moved to the cities and had serious problems with their blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, went back to the bush for just 6 weeks, went back to their traditional hunter-gatherer diet, and most of their levels of insulin and blood pressure, everything fell right back to the normal range, and they lost weight, and essentially they were not symptomatic anymore. And we've seen this with Hawaiian Islanders put back on their traditional diets. So that's one way to do it. But most of us are not prepared to go there. Most of us don't know how to hunt witchetty grubs or like to eat them or whatever those Aborigines were eating. So how do we do it here? And the larger question is, if science is not going to guide us in our food choices, is not ready to tell us how to eat, well then who is? Not me. Don't look to a journalist to tell you how to eat. What I did in trying to come up with these rules of thumb was to find other sources of wisdom. And of course, there is a source of wisdom we have had as long as we have been human. And that source of wisdom is culture. Culture is really just a fancy word for your mom when it comes to food. The ways that the traditions of the group are passed down from mother to daughter to mother to daughter to mother to daughter. Think about, how did you learn to eat? You learned to eat from your mom. How much to eat, when to eat, what to eat things with, combinations, the order in which to eat things, what fork to use when you're eating. These are other sources of wisdom about food. The problem is, of course, mom has had her authority destroyed by $32 billion a year in food marketing. But there is still a lot of wisdom in culture. And this cultural wisdom about food, I need to remind you that this is originally how we navigated what I call the omnivore's dilemma. Think back to that state of nature, the first time that a human tried a mushroom, hadn't been tried before, ate it, keeled over and died. Well, the other people in his group said, all right, we don't want to do that again. How can we avoid that mushroom? And they hit on this brilliant idea. Well, we have this tool called language. We're going to give it a name that's going to help us not eat it anymore. So let's call it the death cap. We'll call it the death cap. Nobody would eat something with death in it. And indeed, we have this mushroom called the death cap. And people avoid eating it. They make mistakes. But the point is, culture can guide us in how to eat. So what I tried to do in this book was see if I couldn't recover some of this cultural wisdom around food and come up with a set of tips. And if you think about it, you have heard these tips from your mother, your grandmother, other ancestors. And indeed, I encourage you, if you have any, to write them down and give them to me, because I've been collecting them. And so, for example, someone at a talk the other night said, well, my grandmother used to say, when Wonder Bread was introduced or something like that, she said, the whiter the bread, the sooner you'll be dead. This is very wise. This is very wise. So in the book, I tried to help, and with this. And my mantra, my little haiku, which I give away this whole book on the cover. You don't need to buy it. You just need to look at it. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I mean, that really is everything I could learn distilled down to that. The hard part is, okay, well, isn't it all food? No, it no longer is all food. And distinguishing the food from what I call the edible food-like substances that are taking over the supermarket is the hard part. So I offer some tips for how to do that. I'll give you just a couple examples because I want to wrap up pretty soon. Don't eat anything your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. Imagine her with you as you're rolling down the aisles in the supermarket, and she gets to the dairy case, and she picks up the box of Go-Gurt portable yogurt tubes. And she takes one of those tubes out of the box, and she thinks, what is this? Is this toothpaste? Is this food? If it is, how do you eat it? Does it go in my mouth? If she read the ingredients, she knows what yogurt is. Yogurt is milk with a little bit of bacteria. That's all it takes. It's a one ingredient or one and a fraction ingredient food. Well, look how many ingredients are in the Go-Gurt portable yogurt tubes. There are 15 or 20 ingredients. They're totally unrecognizable, which leads to another point, which is if a food has more than, say, 5 ingredients, or it's got ingredients you can't pronounce, or if it has high fructose corn syrup, these are signs that something is not a food. I don't mean to demonize high fructose corn syrup, though God knows I've done a lot of that in the last couple of years. But even if it's, I always hear from the Corn Refiners Association whenever I mention this on the air, and they write me this ringing defense of their wonderful product that goes something like this: it's really no worse than sugar. let's grant them that. It's really no worse than sugar. The point is that high fructose corn syrup is a marker of highly processed food, because who do you know who cooks with high fructose corn syrup? I don't know anyone. Any chefs cook with high? No, it's strictly an ingredient on the shelf of the food scientist at the large food corporation. That's it. So if you avoid that, that cuts out all sorts of processed foods. I also suggest shopping along the periphery of the store, because the food that has been less tampered with by the industrialization of our food chain is all there. Not that it hasn't been completely untampered with, that's not true, but it's still whole foods, real foods. You have produce, and then you have meat, and you have fish and dairy, and there are a couple exceptions like the Go-Gurt that sneak in there, but by and large, the stuff you've got to worry about is in the great middle of the store, those canyons of processed packaged foods. That's where the trouble begins, and if you can do most of your shopping along the edge, you're much better off. You're going to eat food. I go further into this and talk about the importance of, and I found this very interesting, learning that food that is well grown in healthy soils turns out to be much more nutritious than foods grown industrially, shipped long distances. This was a fundamental insight of the organic movement. Back in the 1930s, Sir Albert Howard had this quackish sounding thing to say. He said that the whole subject, the whole question of health in soil, plant, animal, and human is one great subject. They're all tied together. Your health, as it turns out, is indivisible from the health of the food chain you're a part of. You can't eat from unhealthy soils and be fully healthy. And we know the reasons for this, that for plants to construct the full complement of all these defensive compounds, that's what they are for them, they're health compounds for us, they need a rich soil. They also need to be somewhat stressed, and that if they're pampered with lots of pesticides, so they don't have to fight off diseases and bugs themselves, they don't produce these compounds. So there's a very interesting science, and some great studies have been done at Davis recently making this point. So that's the whole question of what to eat. That I lay out, and that's a third of my advice. But I also talk about how to eat, because it turns out that the way we eat, the manners, the taboos, the culture we surround our eating with, matters almost as much as what we eat to our health and to our happiness as eaters. And, Americans are, we're really fast eaters. We eat, and we have been for a long time. Even in the 19th century, Europeans commented on how we gobbled our food and ran from the table. We have a lot of trouble slowing down and enjoying food. I think it's our Puritan heritage. All those things that we share with the animals, eating, sex, things like that, we have trouble enjoying. And it's our Puritan inheritance. And cultures that really enjoy eating, that eat at leisurely meals together, they don't eat as much. It's when you eat alone in the car in front of the television, you eat mindlessly and you eat too much. So I attend to that too, and I suggest, I have a couple suggestions like don't, eat at a table. Pretty simple. And no, a desk is not a table. Eating at work is a real problem. And another suggestion is don't get your fuel from the same place your car does. I'll read you this little tip, and then I'll stop and we'll have our conversation. American gas stations now make more money selling food and cigarettes than gasoline, but consider what kind of food this is. Except perhaps for the milk and water, it's all highly processed, non-perishable snack foods and extravagantly sweetened soft drinks in hefty 20-ounce bottles. Gas stations have become processed corn stations, ethanol outside for your car, and high fructose corn syrup inside for you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
same religion that's capable of